podcasting's not one of those overnight success kind of things. Almost nobody gets lightning in a bottle. So if you want to make this a job, if you want to make this a hobby that you do for decades, you're going to have this long-term plan where you're going to keep honing your craft.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It's your host, Adam Adams. And today I'm with Jared Altic. Jared has been podcasting for a while, about 100 episodes. We're right at that peak of 100 as we record this. Maybe by the time you hear it, maybe there'll be even more. And so I'm looking at the podcast, and it appears like it comes out every single week. Looking at the podcast, it's called Hey Chaplain, Wisdom, Support, Encouragement. So we're going to find out, who is the podcast for? How does he serve them? And things like that. And I would like to start by just understanding the avatar. Why do I want to start by understanding the avatar? Because I think your first step is understanding your avatar. Your second step is understanding what you do that's different from anyone else in your space. So let's start there with Jared. Jared, thank you for jumping on the show. Hey, Chaplain, your bio is already in the show notes, so the listener can just scroll down and check it out. The link to your podcast is also in the show notes, so they can scroll down and check it out. So let's talk about those first two things, starting with number one. Who do you serve? Who's your perfect listener?
My perfect listener is that 25-year-old police officer who works the night shift. So he's working overnights, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, things start to slow down. And he's got a couple hours before his shift ends. And he needs encouragement. He needs some wisdom about his career, about his family, about managing the stress of all the trauma he endures. And I don't know if he's going to go and talk to a chaplain or a counselor directly, but he might listen to a chaplain talk to other cops about being a wiser, healthier person. So I'm going to put that out there for him to access on his own time, at his own pace, and let him consume that and grow from it and benefit from it. And I'm not asking for anything from him. That is just being put out there to benefit him. And that's who I want to listen. And I think a percentage of my audience actually is, that exact person. But then I've got a lot of others too.
Yeah. It reminds me of when I did more syndication. I still have a couple of apartment buildings that we raised money for. Mm-hmm. And I had an avatar as well. I had an avatar. Yeah. He was 40-something-year-old, male, Indian engineer who had this amount of kids, this amount of money in the bank. This is the job that he did. This is where he lived. This is what he was worried about and stressed about.
Yep.
And, not everybody that invested with me or listened to my podcast was 40-something-year-old male Indian engineer from his city.
But
some of the people that listen
so much to focus on that one exact person, because you have it in your mind. You can picture them and you know what they might ask next. And so when I'm interviewing somebody, because my show's an interview show, I can put myself in their shoes and ask what they would want to know next. Yep. And man, that makes me a better interviewer than what I would be just on my own.
Yeah. And what I was about to say, though, is that, not everybody who listened was that. Some of them were white and black and Hispanic, and some were tall and short and fat, and some that invested with us were women and some were men. And I don't know for sure if we had any transgenders, but, at least men and women, definitely I'm aware of. And some were older and some were younger, and some had a different job. Some might be doctors or teachers or not all of them were engineers. But like you said, if you've got that person in mind, it really helps you. And I think the takeaway for the listener right now is when Jared answered the question, 25-year-old police officer working nights at 4 a.m., it slows down. He feels stressed. He doesn't know if he can talk to his chaplain. He understands the psychographics, the demographics, and the geographics of this human being. And like you said before, not every single listener is exactly that.
Yeah.
But most of them fit in that box enough. But most of his listeners, the most likely person that listens is just like that avatar. Now, I want to go into understanding what you do that's different. So how do you serve that 25-year-old police officer differently than somebody else who would be wanting to serve that person?
Well, I have a couple advantages in that I'm a police chaplain myself. And so I've been in the car with them. I'm not imagining or drawing from popular media, TV shows and movies. I've actually been in the car during a car stop. I've actually walked up to the house on a domestic violence call and been afraid to stand in front of the front door for fear that they might shoot through the door. I've felt that fear myself. And so there's things like that about the behavior and the movement of cops and the things they're thinking about in the back of their mind while they're talking to you that I've felt in my own body. I know what that's like. And so I have a little bit of an advantage. I'm not a sworn officer. I'm not actually a police officer myself, but I work alongside them. I'm in a department embedded with them, doing the things they do, being with them, at the beginning of their shift at a roll call. I go to like 180 of those a year. And so every week or so, I'm in the police station, interacting with them, listening to them talk about their retirement and their days off and all the stuff, their equipment and everything else. But then I've also gone out with them into the city and been involved. And so I'm speaking from a place of some authority, because I'm not guessing, I'm not trying to reach an audience that I don't know personally. And so being super laser focused on an audience that I know, I can speak, like I said, with some authority. I can be super, super focused. And that actually provides me a second angle that I think is important for a podcaster to consider. As podcasters, we all want to be Joe Rogan. We all want to have everybody listen, which he doesn't actually get everybody, but we think we want everybody in the world to listen to your podcast. But I'm super, super, super focused. There's only like 600,000 cops in the entire country. And I'm focused on patrol cops, younger cops. I'm really focused. I'm narrowing it down smaller and smaller and smaller. And people get afraid of that. Podcasters get afraid of having that narrow of a focus because you worry that you're leaving too much on the table and there's going to be potential listeners that won't listen to you. But I learned from working in the church, because that's my day job. I work in the church, that we have this time in some churches, and actually my church doesn't do it anymore, but you would have this thing during the church service where you'd bring all the little kids up to the front. And then the pastor comes down and teaches a little Bible lesson for like 5 minutes to the little kids. And it seems like everybody else is being ignored. But actually, what's happening is while he's talking to the little kids directly, just a few feet away from them, all of the parents lean in and listen. And those adults might actually listen more closely to that 5-minute lesson than the whole sermon that is directed at them. And that's called overhearing. And overhearing is a powerful thing that we tap into psychologically, that when it's not directed at us, like our defenses go down. And when it's something interesting, like police work, our interest goes up, our defenses are down. I think that I have listeners who are not cops. They've never been cops or not related to cops, but they listen to my show that's directed very laser focused at police officers because they're overhearing. And they learn lessons, they get value, they benefit from the wisdom of police officers talking to other police officers, even though they themselves have never been in law enforcement.
Yeah. So at your church or at somebody's church, let's pretend that there are 600 people in the room. And let's pretend that there are a max of 40 kids within a certain range. So that preacher, that pastor, that deacon, that bishop or whatever,
right,
is up in front of a congregation and they say, I only want the kids from this age to this age.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just pretend it's
right
4, 5, and 6. We'll just pretend randomly.
Right. Yeah, little kids come up to the front of the room. Yep.
All of them leave. And what you're saying is that in some cases, in many cases, even though it's only for less than 10% of the population,
mm-hmm.
sometimes the other 90-ish% of the population leans in, gets on the edge of their seat and makes sure that know exactly what is happening.
It's not for them. And that piques some people's interest, that it's not for me. And we think everything has to be super hyper targeted. And there's a place for that. There really is. That's what marketing accomplishes, is it matches the customer with the service or the product. And that's great, but that's not the full picture. And for me, my podcast is doing better than it probably has ever deserved because people are overhearing and they want to know, what do cops say to other cops? And they lean in and they listen, even though I'm really making no effort to market to them or to even talk to them. But I've got some faithful fans that they support the show, listen, they download in the first hour every week because they want to hear what cops say to other cops.
All right. So we've got so far 3 big takeaways for the podcast today. Takeaway number 1 is niche down so much that you understand everything about your avatar, everything, like what they're worried about, what they're going through. And, Jared does really well about understanding his avatar. In one of the ways is that he joins his avatar in the field, where he's felt scared if he got shot. He's listened to what they're going to do over the weekend, what vacation they've got, what retirement they're working on. And so just understand your avatar to the fullest, the best that you can. That's takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2 is, with understanding how do you serve that person, is making sure that you do it a different way. In Jared's case, how he serves them is by being the person who has walked those steps before, because not everybody can speak eloquently or knowledgeably about some of this stuff. It's more theory. So with Jared, he is able to do it without the theory. So basically,
commonly cops will scare their therapists because the therapist has never been in a police car. They've never been out on a police call, and they find out what happens and how it goes, and the therapist gets frightened by it. And then the cop never goes back to therapy. Right. And so for a chaplain, that's my niche, is to be the one who understands. And I've got one foot in their world. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're good. You're reminding me of a woman I dated for several years. She was an attorney. She interrupted
you a lot?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. She was too good for that. As criminal defense attorney, I would see the most scary, crazy pictures that, cops saw in person, and she only had the photos of what had happened. Yeah. And I couldn't look at most of them. I'd be like, babe, why do you keep showing me this shit? Sorry, I know you work at the church, but that's what I would say to her. I'd be like, why are you still showing? I don't want to see blood. Or, I don't want to see anything like this. Like, this really disturbs me. I don't have the stomach for it. And she just, I guess, wanted to share. So anyway, kind of interesting. It is what police officers see is way worse than what is in a picture. I mean,
and it
imagining being in person.
I can tell you, I do a little about armchair psychology here. That girlfriend, she felt isolated by the horrible things that she witnessed, even though it was only photos. But she was also talking to victims and perpetrators and whatever. And so she was experiencing stuff that no one else in her world experiences. None of her family, none of her boyfriend, nobody else sees that. So she felt isolated. And feeling isolated, she wanted to reach out and say, will you share this with me? And most of us say no. And so that's why I have an audience that wants to hear what other cops have to say. If my show was a solo show, I don't think it would work as well, because I'm only kind of halfway in their world. If they're going to listen, they want to know that the person giving advice really understands. And so it's important for us as podcasters not to be in our ivory tower dispensing advice, shooting from the hip, talking about stuff we don't understand. We need to be experts on something, which is where, niching down and getting down to the granular level. Go be an expert in one thing and then talk about that. Don't try to be an expert on everything, because your audience is going to smell the malarkey, and they're going to reject you.
And the third takeaway was overhearing. That was interesting. It's something that I had not heard it in that way before, but it is so true. And I've seen myself with scrolling through sometimes YouTube, sometimes podcasts, sometimes other types of content where it's not anything that I actually would normally care about, but it's just like, what is that like? I'm curious. And so you might jump into a police officer, hey, chaplain. You might just jump into it and be like, let me get a little feel for this. And you become one of those, 90% of the people that are listening, but you become one that's listening more intent because you're like, this is interesting to me. That's a cool takeaway.
You can do it on the fly too. And I've heard you do it in your show. where you'll be given advice and then you will pause and narrow down on a specific type of podcaster that needs a specific type of help. And for the next 3 minutes, you're only really talking to a fraction of your audience. But you know what? The rest of us listen in because either we can identify because we used to be there, or we're wanting to check to see if you're really going to give good advice. So we're listening probably closer to that than we are the rest of the show. And that thing that we do, we can use that to be better communicators as podcasters. If we're aware of how that works, when I'm preaching a sermon, sometimes I'll just kind of call a timeout mid-sermon and say, okay, now listen, I'm just talking to the men in the audience today. Just for 5 minutes, guys. Ladies, you can go look on your phones or something, but guys, I want to talk to you. Well, none of the ladies look on their phones. They listen closer because I'm just talking to the men. Yeah. And we can use that as a tool. You should always do it honestly, always be transparent about it, but you can use it as a communication tool when you're communicating to a group.
I know for a fact that if I was in a church or even a secular thing, it doesn't have to be a church, okay? If I was at a place and if my kid was one of them, 100% sure, I would be taking better notes than I would take at any other part for a lot of reasons. I would want to be able to have that conversation with the kid, see what the kid learned. I would want to make sure that it was good advice, not bad advice, that I could tweak anything. So I would be like, my hairs would probably stand up at the back of my neck. If I was a werewolf or something, which I'm not, you don't have to worry. But I think that I'd be like listening way more intently, just like you're saying. So it's a great takeaway, the concept of overhearing. And prior to us recording, like in the green room, you mentioned that overhearing was one of the cool takeaways for the listener. And you had another takeaway. Can I convince you to go straight to that fourth topic right now?
Sure. The last one I mentioned? Yeah. Practice. You might be listening to me right now and thinking, oh, well, he just naturally has a baritone voice and it's easy on the microphone or what have you. But I've been speaking on a microphone for 30 years. I mean, this is because of my experience in church. I've been recorded for ages. I've got not just CDs of me preaching. I've got cassette tapes of me preaching, which nobody wants to hear. Okay. I don't want to hear them. But that it represents decades of working and developing mic technique and knowing how to talk to other adults and talk to different audiences, sometimes just men or just women or just kids or whatever. You need practice. And then, podcasting is not one of those overnight success kind of things. Almost nobody gets lightning in a bottle. So if you want to make this a job, if you want to make this a hobby that you do for decades, you're going to have this long-term plan where you're going to keep honing your craft. You're going to keep working on all the little things, the technique and how to clean up your content, how to edit better, all the things that you might have as part of your podcasting experience. You need to keep working, keep practicing, and going back and listening to your old content. I do that every once in a while. Just pull up an episode from a year ago and listen to it and cringe because I know how much I've changed and how much I've learned, but I want to keep learning. And so I'm going to keep, consuming that knowledge. I listen to your show, even though I'm probably not your target demographic anymore, because you keep saying things that I hadn't thought of. And so I'm always wanting to learn. I never see myself as having already arrived. I want to keep collecting information and practicing.
Yeah. One takeaway that I'm hearing from you on consistency, just putting in the time, putting the effort. Well, first and foremost, I'm just going to mention that I think of it as like when we go to the gym. We might start as strong, we might start as weak, we might start in the middle. And if we go once, whether or not we go for 5 minutes or 7 hours, all straight, we don't change like overnight. That overnight success, it doesn't exist. It doesn't really happen. I mean,
no.
Going
back again and again.
Yeah.
And again.
Even the biggest of bodybuilders, even when they're taking like testosterone and whatever else they take,
they still got to put in the
human
work.
growth hormone and all of that. Even the bodybuilders, like they're on stage after they've been putting in the work like for 12 years nonstop. They're working out for an hour or two, 5 to 6 days a week.
Yeah.
Always, whether they're sick or not, for 12 years. And that's when they look like that. And see, it never changes overnight. It changes over time. And you were talking about how the podcast is not an overnight success. And you got to be thinking about it a long-term plan. And I will mention two things I'm thinking. Anybody who comes to my team, I have a company which serves podcasters called Grow Your Show. Anyone who comes to the team, I will make sure if they're joining us thinking that we're going to help them, I say, are you in this for the long haul? Like if you're launching a brand new podcast, the minimum amount of time that I'm willing to hear you say before I start working for you is that you'll do this at least 3 years. Now, I hope it goes way more. 10 years, 12 years, just like the bodybuilder, but it's a long-term plan. So if somebody's like, oh, I hope that in 3 months I'm making $1 million a month, I'm like, no. Like you go do something different.
No.
But also
maybe if you were already a celebrity, if you were already
right,
famous,
that's true. That's
and
true.
could dump tens of thousands of dollars into it from the very first day, maybe. Yep. But no, that's for the other 99.9% of us, it's going to be a long time of working and honing your craft.
Yeah. The other point that I wanted to make, the thing that I was thinking about is just a couple of days ago, it was really recently, I saw somebody's Facebook post and they asked, how long did it take you to achieve your overnight success? And the answers were amazing because it was like 3 years, 12 years, 20 years, 2 decades. And that's how long it took people to achieve an overnight success. I don't think I saw any answers that were like 3 months. I don't think there was anything. It was most of the stuff was 2 years or way more. So really good stuff. So let's take a quick break. And when we get back, I know I'll at least ask you, like, if you restarted everything over from scratch, what would you do differently? And I'll also get your best advice and any other takeaways you want to share with the listener. We'll be right back. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. We are back with Jared Altic. And like I mentioned before, it's from the podcast. He's from the podcast from Hey Chaplain, where he serves mainly new cops that are doing the night shift, maybe 25 years old, stressed, going through everything that he's going through. And I loved how prior to the first part of the show, we really got into the psychographics, demographics of his perfect avatar. How does he serve them? What does he do differently, like to stand out from anyone else that wants to serve that person? So we've learned a ton of really cool things. And now I want to really just find out if he was starting a podcast over right now. He's done 100 episodes, we'll call it. Probably more when you hear this. What would he do differently? So I think that that's a good question, because if you're a podcaster, like the things that you think need to happen do not always have to happen. And some of the things that you never thought about become really important. So Jared, if you started from scratch right now, what would you do differently?
I think one thing that scared me when I was first getting into podcasting was the cost of equipment. And I was worried about, well, I need to buy the budget microphone and the budget interface and all the cheapest stuff and the free subscriptions to everything. And I didn't get very far into it before I realized that was a mistake. And the free subscriptions became paid subscriptions, and I could figure out which ones I actually needed and which ones I could dispense with. But the equipment, I'm building a tote full of old podcasting equipment that I never should have bought in the first place because it was cheap. It was the wrong kind of equipment. I didn't do my research first, and I would have spent less money if I'd bought the mid-range or even in a few cases, a little bit more expensive equipment to start with. And you may say, well, I don't know if I want to do this or not. Then make those decisions before you get, down this road. If you're just playing around, borrow equipment, rent equipment. Don't purchase the cheapest stuff. And if you think you might not go with it, then, go do something else. That's fine. But if you think you really want to commit to this, then go ahead. And I'm not talking tens of thousands of dollars, but $250 microphone versus a $25 microphone actually does make a difference. And so that might be better not to buy that $25 one in the first place.
So, Jared, if you did it again, it sounds like one of the things you would do is instead of being cheap, you would have invested a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, something we mention on the podcast a lot, ready, fire, aim versus ready, aim, fire. I really advocate ready, aim, fire. But if you're listening to this and you're like, I am a ready, fire, aim type of person, I can fix it later. It's totally fine. Well, I'll take away, I was having a conversation with my mom recently. I'll take away that I got from that is that the fire doesn't have to mean that the podcast is published crappily.
Right.
The fire really could be that you look for the right kind of microphone. I mean, what is wrong with taking 4.5 minutes to find out what is actually the best kind of microphone, rather than just going straight to Amazon and picking up the crappy one that gets promoted immediately?
Yep.
It's like $120 usually. And just buying that because Amazon picked it and you're like, fire. No, why can't fire be like, hey, what type of microphone? What kind of microphones are there? After 4.5 minutes, you're ready to buy a microphone that's actually decent, and you won't have to pay $120. You could probably get one for $70.
Yeah.
That is really, really good.
Is it okay if I mention a product negatively?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think I know which one you're going to say because it's been mentioned before.
3 or 4 years ago, the microphone that got pushed in the Amazon algorithms was a Blue Yeti, and it's the wrong type of microphone.
It's still getting pushed literally this second. If we type in Amazon, what's a good podcast mic? That one is the first one. And the second one is also a bad one. I don't remember. It's called a blue. There's Blue Yeti. And then there's like a blue.
Like a
I don't remember.
Or something.
Snowball. It is literally a snowball. But it's both of them are condenser mics. Yeah. It is.
I feel like when I'm listening to other podcasts, and I listen to a lot of cop podcasts. So these are police officers trying to do their own podcast. And I feel like I can tell when they're on a Blue Yeti because of how bad it sounds. And I agree. I can literally hear someone walking across the room. I should never hear that.
Dogs barking, cars driving.
My goodness, the neighbors
breathing,
mowing the yard.
Echo, mowing.
It's horrible. I can hear the whole room. And that's just a bad microphone. There's stuff that you can do in your microphone choice and in your editing process that can remove that and make it so you're not asking your listener to do the work.
Yeah.
You could just do a little bit of research and eliminate that whole problem.
So if your heart is set on ready, fire, aim, make the fire mean something just slightly different. Make the fire mean I'm going to study this. Make the fire mean I'm going to do the steps in order to have a good one. Don't just get a crappy podcast or a crappy microphone.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay. So if he did it again, he would invest a little bit differently. Instead of investing in a cheap one, then a medium one, then the top one, he might have just invested with the medium, or he might have just invested with the top one, but he would have done a little bit of research first. Number 2, what would you say is the best advice that you have, Jared, for a brand new podcaster, somebody who's not quite as far along as you?
It's nothing new, but it's good advice. Make the show you would want to listen to. And maybe it's not the show you want to listen to right now. Maybe it's the show you needed a year ago or 10 years ago. Make something that you would want to hear. I hate, again, listening to new podcasters, people who are just trying to get into the space that are bored with their own show. And it's like, man, why are you even doing this if this isn't interesting to you, if this isn't a passion, if this isn't something that you just feel like you got to roll out of bed and go help this avatar? If you don't have that kind of passion, why are you doing a podcast? You're wasting your time. You're wasting my time. It's another pet peeve. It's like, why are you bored with your own show? If you were bored, let's say you make a bad podcast. Let's say you get an interview and they're interrupting you all the time. Just not a great interview.
You're pointing at me when you're saying they're interrupting you all the time.
No,
so I did it again on purpose.
Doing that to you. But let's say it's just a bad interview. What law says you have to publish that interview? Why put that content out there if it's not good content? And so we make a lot of mistakes because we're just kind of mindlessly doing this thing. Because I've just got to produce more content. I'm in this rat race, this hamster wheel of producing more content. Let's be picky. Let's take our time. Let's make good content. Let's go ahead and edit, because the listener doesn't care that you had a telephone call and they don't want to listen to you try to answer it and get rid of them. Cut that out and make a better product. And that'll be more satisfying to you, better for your listener. There's a lot of mistakes that we make as rookies that I wish I hadn't made them, but I don't want to see other people relearn the same mistakes on their own. Yeah. Learn from us who've made those mistakes.
Well, I'm grateful that you shared some of those mistakes and how to fix them. And I want to ask you another question, because it's interesting. I'm a podcast coach. And so sometimes I think that only people who are asking questions about podcasting, they only come to me. Sometimes I think that, and it's ridiculous, because when I had a podcast for only 3 months, or for only a couple of months, I was at a conference and people kept coming up to me and asking me questions, and I would actually serve them. So I want to ask you, Jared, I know it doesn't sound like you're a podcast coach, but I think because you have a show, lots of people ask you lots of things. So I want to just get a few commonly asked questions that your friends, your family, or people that you work with, when they're thinking about starting a podcast, what are they usually asking you?
It seems to me that I get a lot of questions about getting famous, about getting noticed, about getting attention. And that's always a little bit of a red flag. Maybe that's the counselor in me. It's not that what we do doesn't draw attention. It does. I mean, you've got to be a little bit full of yourself to think, I'm going to talk into a microphone and there's going to be thousands of people who listen. But sometimes we have an unhealthy, an extra unhealthy relationship to that. And if you just want the attention, go make a TikTok video, go make cat videos, go do something that's less intensive, less time consuming, because podcasting is work. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to edit. You're going to have to promote. There's work you're going to have to do. And if you don't want that work, if you just want to get attention, there's easier ways to do it. And meanwhile, you're cluttering up the podcasting space for people who really do have a passion for helping people. They have a passion for teaching and for spreading information and having great conversations. Not everything that you think is interesting. That you have to cultivate what is interesting and what would be good for an audience. And for me, it's taken me decades to really tune in to what is effective and how do I program my show? What does going from one episode to the next episode, what kind of topics do I cover and how do I space them out? And when do I change pace? That took a long time to learn. It's not just my random thoughts, in a raw audio dump. That's not good technique. That's not productive. I wish that some of the people who come asking, boy, how do I get attention? How do I get famous? I wish they just would go do something else. And often I direct them away from podcasting, even though I love podcasting.
Yeah. When I first was starting my first podcast, I thought about, I never asked a question, how do I get famous? But I did I made an assumption that just simply by having a podcast, then millions of people would know who I was. Mm-hmm. You made a cool, interesting thought on that earlier in this episode, even with Joe Rogan, where you mentioned that even though there might be millions of people listening, there's billions of people. So there's 500 times, maybe 1 out of 500 people listens.
Right.
And so it's not really that. It's not really that big. And thinking about you and me and our podcast and what we're trying to achieve, niching down is pretty good. So getting famous, notice, and attention, like you said, I don't think that it needs to be the very first parts either. There are some other parts that can be kind of like prior to that. But there are also some things we can do to kind of grow if we're willing to do the long game, So great takeaway there.
Commitment is really the thing. If you think you want a podcast, are you willing to do this for multiple years? Are you willing to do this through hundreds of episodes? Or are you just wanting to dabble? If you're just wanting to dabble, why don't you look into being a guest on someone else's show? Which I think a lot of people shy away from because they just want the green light to jump in and start talking. And if you go ask to be on someone else's show, they might tell you no.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think I have a client, I won't mention her name, but she knows who she is. She listens to every episode. I have a client that I suggested that she start getting guest places on other people's podcasts. And she's like, I'm not ready. I don't want to do that right now. I have other things that I'm focusing on. I have other things that I care about. And I'm like, but you're going to grow your podcast. I feel like maybe she's a little afraid to do it, even though it's a beneficial part of our journey, I think, as podcasters. So
there's an obstacle. Go ahead. There's an obstacle to overcome is perfectionism, where you feel like, well, I don't want to go on someone else's show because I'm not good enough, or I'm going to record an episode and then I'm going to edit it for weeks and I'm never going to be finished editing because I'm afraid to put it out. Now, I'm an advocate of someone recording a few episodes and just practicing. They're never going to see the light of day. Those are just practice. But still, at some point, you've got to be willing to put yourself out there. And there's a perfectionist barrier that keeps us from jumping in. And so you should absolutely get on other shows. You should reach out. You should volunteer your time and do it selflessly. Do it not just to promote your show. Do it so you can help their show get better and mean it genuinely from the heart. There's a lot of good karma, for lack of a better word, that goes back and forth between podcasters. If you genuinely help them, they might help you later. They won't always, but they might. And that's a good investment in the community. And so don't let perfectionism be this barrier that keeps you from ever producing your first episode.
A lot of value in what you just shared. And I'm imagining that she's going to call me and say, hey, I listened to that episode and you're right. Maybe I am going to get on some other people's podcasts.
It'll be funnier if you have 2 or 3 clients that call and think that you were talking about them.
They're like, was that me? What were you saying? Yeah. So anyway, let's wrap it up. Let's wrap up the conversation today. So this is Jared Altic, and he runs the podcast, Hey Chaplain. And you can find that in the show notes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Furthermore, just to kind of wrap up what we've talked about, it's important to do those first steps. Overhearing was a great takeaway. Consistency and practice was another good takeaway. Not becoming an overnight success, but having a long-term plan is a good takeaway. Getting on other people's podcasts is another great takeaway. Knowing your avatar and what is your USP, unique selling proposition. The thing that you do differently to serve that person. Psychographics was a good one. We talked about investing at the right time in the right moment. We talked about ready, fire, aim versus ready, aim, fire and how that's done. A few commonly asked questions that people have, and should we be thinking about getting famous? And I'll mention to you also, to the listener, that a couple of things. We'll just say 3 quick things. Number 1, if you heard Jared say, you've got to practice, you've got to edit, you've got to promote. And in case that stressed you out, I want to mention that my team does some editing and promoting and a lot of the other back office stuff to allow you to just be the star of your show. So if you were feeling stressed and overwhelmed and it was like, I'm not going to even do a podcast, give us a call. Maybe we can support you on some of the hard stuff so you can focus on the fun stuff. Same thing, getting noticed, famous, and attention. Maybe it shouldn't be your first focus, but if you need help with growing the podcast audience, our company serves you to be able to get you in front of more of the right people. And it's done without you having to do all the legwork. And so if you do want to be more famous, not that it's your first ever priority, but having a bigger audience sometimes can benefit you and the audience. Let us know. That's what we focus on. That's our big thing at Grow Your Show. If you build it, they will come is not always true. Sometimes you got to add fuel to the fire. Sometimes you got to add fuel to the tank. You're not automatically have 1 million listeners just because you have a podcast, like Joe Rogan. Once you have that podcast, you've got to tell people, you've got to spread the word. You've got to niche down, like Jared said, niche down, know who you're serving.
And that's
in a very small audience.
Absolutely key. Because when I go to conferences and conventions, my standard joke is that I'm Jared Altic. I'm the host of the largest police chaplain podcast in the world. It's also the only police chaplain podcast in the world. And that's unique. You know, I found a niche that nobody else was producing content. When I became a police chaplain, that's the first thing I did is I looked for a podcast, and one did not exist. So I made one. And having a niche like that, man, I am at the top of the pyramid. And I've been doing it for some years now. So now, even if there are others that jump in and do it too, I'm now the old guy in the room. I'm the savvy veteran that's been there and done that. So it's good to find a niche.
That's perfect. I agree with you on niching. Real quick to the listener, the next episode is a really good episode. I already recorded it and I'm stoked for it to be coming out. It's something that I think you need to know. It's just a solo episode with you and me. I will see you there. You know, I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.